I don't know how other guitar companies function actually from the inside out, but I've gotten to know a little bit about the Daisy Rock family, and I love the way they are passionate about what they do.
Here is something that does not add up. For nearly 4 decades, Vicki Peterson smiled through every interview, said all the right things, and kept her composure, even when the questions got uncomfortable. She was the guitarist, the co-writer, the one standing slightly to the side while the cameras found someone else. And, for a long time, she seemed fine with that. Or at least, she seemed fine with saying she was fine with it. But at 68, something shifted. She started talking, really talking, and what came out was not the polished, rehearsed version of events that fans had grown accustomed to hearing. It was something rawer, something that finally gave shape to the rumors that had been circling the Bangles for years. Rumors about Susanna Hoffs, about what really happened inside that band, and about why it all fell apart the way it did. The cracks nobody was supposed to see. People who followed the Bangles closely in the late 80s noticed something was off long before the breakup was announced. The body language in interviews had changed. The way the band members spoke about each other, always technically warm, always carefully worded, started to feel rehearsed. And at the center of almost every uncomfortable moment was the same dynamic. Susanna Hoffs standing slightly apart from the group, not by accident, but because the world kept pulling her that way. The rumor that refused to die was this: that the Bangles did not simply break up because of creative differences, or exhaustion, or the natural end of a run. The rumor was that something specific happened between Vicki Peterson and Susanna Hoffs, that there was a falling out serious enough to fracture not just the band, but the friendship underneath it. And for years, neither of them said enough to confirm or deny it properly. What made it worse was the silence. When bands split and everyone moves on quietly, fans eventually accept it. But when members spend years giving interviews that dance around the same sore spots without ever landing on anything solid, it keeps the speculation alive. Every careful non-answer felt like confirmation that there was something being protected. Vicki Peterson spent most of her post-Bangles years working behind the scenes, producing, mentoring, collaborating with her sister Debbie on their folk project The Psycho Sisters. She was present in the music world, but not loudly so. Which is exactly why, when she started opening up in recent years, people paid attention. Because Vicki Peterson had earned a reputation for being the one who held things together quietly. And if she was finally letting things out, there had to be a reason. Built differently from the start. To understand what eventually broke down between them, you have to go back to how it was built. The Bangles came together in Los Angeles in 1981, and from the very beginning, the women in that room were not working from the same blueprint. Vicki Peterson and her sister Debbie came in with a garage rock instinct. They were drawn to the rawness of 60s girl groups, the kind of sound that felt lived in and unpolished, music that had grit because the people making it had grit. Vicki's guitar playing reflected that. She was not interested in perfection, she was interested in feeling. Susanna Hoffs came from a different place. She had studied art at the University of California and brought with her a sensibility that was more focused on melody, on emotional precision, on the idea that a song could be constructed with the same intentionality you would bring to a painting. Her voice was not the loudest in the room, but it had a quality that drew people in, something sweet and aching at the same time. In the early days, that contrast worked in the band's favor. Their sound had texture because the people making it were not thinking alike. The tension between Vicki's instinct to push harder and Susanna's instinct to refine everything created something genuinely interesting. But tension that produces good work is still tension, and over time it found places to settle that were not always comfortable. By the time they were recording what would become their breakthrough material in the mid-80s, the disagreements were no longer just creative conversations. They were becoming something more personal. Questions about identity, about what the band stood for, about whose vision was going to define them going forward. When Susanna became the face, no single person decided that Susanna Hoffs would become the public face of the Bangles. It was not a boardroom decision or a management strategy, at least not initially. It was the accumulation of 100 smaller decisions made by editors and photographers and television producers who were operating by the logic of their own industries. And that logic, in the 1980s, was not interested in nuance about collective contribution. When Manic Monday became a genuine phenomenon in 1986, reaching number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and introducing the Bangles to an audience far larger than anything they had previously reached, the press apparatus that covered popular music needed a way to talk about the band quickly and simply. Susanna gave them that. She was magnetic in front of cameras in a way that read as effortless. She gave interviews that were warm and specific and easy to turn into quotable pieces. She had a quality that lent itself to cover shoots, something in the directness of her gaze, the accessibility of her presence. Editors noticed. Decisions followed. Within a relatively short period after their commercial breakthrough, the coverage had shifted in a way that was subtle enough to be deniable, but clear enough to be felt. Stories about the Bangles increasingly featured Susanna prominently and the other 3 members as supporting context. Photo shoots that began as group portraits somehow ended up emphasizing her. The language of coverage shifted from the Bangles to Susanna Hoffs of the Bangles, a small grammatical change that carried enormous weight for the people it was pushing to the margins. Vicki Peterson described this period in ways that were difficult to misread. She talked about group interviews, where questions were funneled so consistently toward Susanna that the rest of the band would sit there working out how to participate in a conversation that had effectively stopped including them. It was not malicious. It was not even, in most cases, intentional. The journalists asking questions were following the path of least resistance, which led to the person in the room that the media machinery had already decided was the story. That made it harder to address, not easier, because there was no villain to point to, just a system grinding forward. Vicki's frustration during this period was genuine, and it was also, she would eventually admit, more tangled than simple resentment. The complicating factor was that Susanna had not sought this out. She had not campaigned to be the face of the band or worked behind the scenes to redirect attention toward herself. She had adapted to circumstances that had been created largely without her input, the way most people adapt to circumstances, by finding a way to function within them. That reality did not dissolve Vicki's frustration, but it made the frustration harder to place cleanly, because the person who seemed most logical to be angry at had not actually done the thing that was causing the problem. Walk Like an Egyptian reaching the top of the Billboard Hot 100 for 4 consecutive weeks in 1986, and then Eternal Flame hitting number 1 across the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several other markets in 1989, only accelerated the dynamic. The bigger the songs became, the more Susanna's image became attached to them in the public imagination. By the time the breakup came, the media had spent years constructing a version of the Bangles story in which the other 3 members were essentially background. Talented, certainly, but background nonetheless. That was not the truth of what the band was. It was, however, the version of the story that had been told loudly enough and long enough to feel like the truth. What the breakup was really about. The official account of the Bangles' 1989 breakup was always managed carefully. Creative differences was the phrase that did the most work in those early explanations, broad enough to be technically accurate, vague enough to avoid saying anything specific. Individual members talked about wanting to explore solo projects, about the natural arc of a band reaching its end, about how 8 years is a long time, and people grow and change. All of that was true. None of it was the whole story. What became clearer over the years that followed, through interviews that grew incrementally more candid as the distance from those events increased, was that the band had been carrying weight from multiple directions for a long time before the formal announcement. The creative disagreements had never been fully resolved. They had been managed, worked around, set aside in favor of getting records made and tours completed. The media imbalance had been acknowledged in careful public statements, but never actually addressed in any structural way. And beneath both of those things was something that took longer to surface, a question of trust that had been eroding quietly for years. Vicki Peterson has talked, in the years since, about the feeling of watching the band's identity be reshaped by forces outside the band and feeling powerless to do anything about it from the inside. She was not passive during this period. She pushed back. She advocated for the band's original sound. She spoke publicly about the importance of every member's contribution. But advocacy has limits when the machine doing the reshaping is larger than the people trying to redirect it. And when your advocacy consistently fails to change the outcome, it changes you. It makes you tired. It makes you turn inward. It makes the gap between what you say in interviews and what you actually think grow wider. The rumor that had persisted through all the years of careful public statements, that the breakup had involved genuine personal hurt between Vicki and Susanna, not just professional disagreement, is what Vicki's more recent candor began to confirm. She has described the final period before the breakup as one where the working relationship between her and Susanna had become strained in ways that went beyond artistic debate, where they were professionally functional but personally distant, where the trust that had once allowed them to argue fiercely in studios and then go to dinner together had been replaced by something more guarded and more fragile. Susanna's own account, as it emerged through her memoir and subsequent interviews, described a different kind of difficulty from the same period. She wrote about carrying guilt, not guilt over intentions, but guilt over effects. Being the person the industry had chosen to elevate meant being the person whose presence, however unintentionally, had diminished the others. She understood what was happening. She had watched it happen and had not known how to stop it. That understanding did not translate into action that changed anything, which was its own source of pain. What neither of them addressed publicly for a very long time was the specific texture of what had broken between them. The moments, the conversations, the things that had been said or left unsaid that made the last stretch of the Bangles genuinely hard to be inside. That was the territory that the careful interviews had always stepped around. And it was that territory that Vicki's more recent honesty began, for the first time, to actually enter. At 68, Vicki finally says it. The change in how openly Vicki Peterson spoke did not happen overnight. It was gradual, a word here, a slightly less guarded phrasing there, interviews where the careful distance she had always maintained began to close. But by the time she was approaching and passing 68, there was a noticeable difference between how she talked about the Bangles years and how she had talked about them for most of the previous 3 decades. She began acknowledging jealousy directly, not as an abstract concept or a general hazard of being in a band, but as something she had personally carried for a long time and that had personally affected her judgment and her relationships. She talked about having been angry at Susanna for things that, when examined honestly, were not Susanna's fault, and about how long it had taken her to make that separation clearly enough to do anything productive with it. She confirmed that the relationship between her and Susanna during the final years of the Bangles had been genuinely strained. Not the kind of strained that generates dramatic confrontations or explosive arguments that later make for good storytelling. The quieter, more corrosive kind, where two people share a professional life, and the warmth that used to exist between them has been replaced by careful distance. Where you do the work because the work still matters. But the thing that made doing the work with this particular person meaningful has gone somewhere you cannot easily reach. She talked about the reunion process in ways that reframed what fans had understood about it. The collaboration on the John Lennon tribute in the late 90s, which had seemed at the time like a fairly organic reconnection, was described by Vicki as something more deliberate and more fragile than it had appeared. Susanna had made the first move. She had reached out and proposed they do something together, and Vicki had said yes, but the yes was not effortless. It was the decision of someone who recognized that the alternative was to let something irreplaceable stay broken. The full reunion and everything that followed, including the Doll Revolution album in 2003 and the touring that accompanied it, had required the kind of work that does not get documented because it happens in private. Conversations that were uncomfortable. Acknowledgements that cost something. A deliberate choice, repeated over time, to prioritize what they had built together over the damage that had been done to it. Vicki was clear that what came out the other side was not a restoration of what had existed before. It was something different, a relationship between two people who knew each other's difficult edges precisely and had decided, with full information, to remain close anyway. The competition that had made things painful had not vanished, but it had been relocated somewhere that no longer threatened the foundation. She also confirmed something that the rumors had always implied but never quite landed on, that the story of the Bangles was not, at its core, about a rivalry. It was about two people who cared deeply about the same thing, came at it from different directions, and had to find a way to make that workable. The years when they could not were hard. The years when they could were something worth protecting. What remains? Both women are now in their 60s, and the shape of their lives reflects something different from what either of them might have predicted during the most difficult years of the Bangles. They have continued to make things, separately, occasionally together, always with the discipline of people who never stopped taking the work seriously. Susanna published her debut novel in April 2023, stepping into a creative space that had nothing to do with her history as a musician, and earning reviews that evaluated her on those terms alone. The book was received well, not as a curiosity from a former pop star, but as a piece of writing that held up on its own. The same month, she released a cover album called The Deep End that drew from a range of influences and demonstrated, for those paying attention, that her musical instincts had continued to develop in directions that the Bangles context would never have accommodated. Vicki has stayed embedded in the music world through a different set of channels. She has produced, collaborated, and continued working with Debbie on the Psycho Sisters. She has shown up at workshops and music programs in ways that put her expertise in direct contact with people who are earlier in their careers and have practical use for what she knows. The Psycho Sisters album, released in 2014, was a quiet project in the best sense, made by people who no longer needed anything from the music except the music itself. They still speak regularly. Both have said so in interviews conducted independently of each other, which is a more reliable indicator than if only one of them had mentioned it. They talk about creative projects. They talk about books. They show up for each other in the ways that matter to people who have known each other for more than 4 decades and have no interest in pretending that history away. What Vicki confirmed at 68 was not the kind of revelation that generates headlines for a news cycle and then disappears. It was quieter than that and more durable. She confirmed that the tensions were real, that the hurt was real, and that the work of repairing what had been damaged was also real, deliberate and unglamorous and worth it. She confirmed that the rumors people had been carrying for 30 years about what had passed between her and Susanna were not wrong, even if they had never captured the full complexity of it. The Bangles made music that has outlasted the era it came from. Walk Like an Egyptian and Eternal Flame are not oldies radio nostalgia pieces. They are songs that people who were not alive in 1986 still encounter and respond to. That longevity belongs to everyone who made them. But the story Vicki finally told belongs to something smaller and more specific. Two people who built something remarkable, strained it almost to breaking, and chose, deliberately, imperfectly, repeatedly, not to let it break all the way. That choice, more than any album or chart position, is what actually lasted. What are your thoughts about Vicki and Susanna? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.